My name is Olivia Sullivan, and for the longest time, I was invisible. Not invisible in the way you see in movies where someone walks through life unnoticed. No, I was invisible in the most painful way possible, invisible to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I was invisible to my family while living under the same roof, surrounded by people who saw me every single day but never actually looked at me. For 15 years, I lived in a mansion that felt more like a prison, where the rules were simple and cruel. I cooked, I cleaned, I served, and I stayed quiet. My younger sister Sarah lived in the same house, in the same family, but she inhabited a completely different world. While I was scrubbing kitchen counters until my hands bled and my nails were permanently stained, Sarah was upstairs getting her hair and makeup done for yet another exclusive party that I would never be invited to. While I was meal prepping in the kitchen for events I wasn't allowed to attend, for parties where my presence would have been considered an embarrassment, Sarah was laughing with her friends, shopping on Park Avenue, and becoming the golden child that everyone adored and celebrated. While I was working 16-hour days planning events, my sister was sleeping until noon and complaining about how exhausted she was from her leisurely brunch schedule. My parents, Margaret and Richard Sullivan, were wealthy beyond measure. Old money, the kind that came from real estate investments and family trusts that had been accumulating wealth since before I was even born. We lived in a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the kind of place where people took architectural tours and whispered about the details and the history. The kind of place that appeared in magazines and was featured on those home design shows that everyone watched. But behind those pristine walls, behind the carefully maintained facade of a successful and happy family, something darker was happening. Something that nobody outside the family would ever know about. Something that had become so normal, so routine, that I had stopped recognizing it as abuse. That is, until one Christmas Eve changed everything. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Help me show her that my voice deserves to be amplified. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Let's make this channel a sanctuary for people who have been overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten. Now, let's continue. I need to take you back to where this all began, to the girl I was before everything fell apart and then came back together in ways I never could have imagined. I was 17 years old when I realized that my life wasn't normal. Most kids probably realize this earlier, I suppose, but I had been living in a bubble of denial so thick, so impenetrable, that it took me nearly 2 decades to acknowledge what was happening to me and why. My mother called me into her office that day, and I remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. The sunlight was streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the dust particles that floated through the air like tiny stars. She was sitting behind her massive mahogany desk, the one that had belonged to her father before her, passed down through generations of family power and control. The wood was so polished that it reflected the light like a mirror, and I could see myself in it, small and insignificant. She was looking at me with an expression that I had come to know all too well over the years. It was the look of disappointment mixed with barely concealed disdain, the look that said she was about to ask me to do something that would further diminish my sense of self-worth. My mother explained to me that Sarah's friend Madison was throwing an 18th birthday party, and it was going to be the event of the season. 200 guests, a live band, catering from the most exclusive restaurants in New York City. The kind of party that would be talked about for years, that would be featured in social media feeds and discussed at country clubs. But there was a problem. The caterers had double-booked themselves. Some miscommunication had led to them taking 2 events on the same night, and they had just called to cancel. The timing was impossible to recover from. So my mother, with the casual cruelty that had become her trademark, asked if I would be willing to help coordinate the food. Not to attend the party, mind you. Not to celebrate with my sister. Not to wear a nice dress and enjoy the evening alongside my family. But to work in the kitchen, preparing dishes, ensuring everything ran smoothly, staying hidden in the background, and then to disappear before the guests arrived, so as not to embarrass the family with my presence. She didn't want anyone to know that they had to resort to using their daughter as hired help. I was the help, even though I shared the same blood, lived under the same roof, carried the same last name, and had the same right to be treated with dignity and respect. I said yes, of course. I always said yes. That was the role I had accepted, consciously or not, over the course of my entire childhood. I was the invisible daughter, the one who existed to serve the family's needs without complaint, without question, without hope that things would ever be different. The years between 17 and 32 passed in a blur of similar moments, each one reinforcing the pattern, each one cementing my role further. Cooking elaborate meals for my parents' charity galas while watching from the kitchen as my mother took full credit for the menus I had designed, describing them to guests as her own creations. Organizing my sister's birthday parties, her graduation celebration, her engagement party, all while Sarah thanked our mother profusely for throwing such wonderful celebrations and never once acknowledged my work. I watched my sister receive a car for her 18th birthday, a Mercedes-Benz in champagne silver with a bow on top, the kind of gift that changes a teenager's life. For my 18th birthday, I received a new apron embroidered with the family crest. I watched my sister go to Yale and major in art history, a subject she was passionate about but would never actually use professionally. For my education, I received cooking lessons from my mother, who treated them more like critiques than instruction. I taught myself to cook by watching cooking shows late at night when the house was quiet and I could think without interruption. I would experiment with recipes on my own time, using the family's expensive ingredients, trying to perfect techniques that would eventually make my sister look good at her parties. I became a master chef-level cook, someone who could prepare Michelin star quality meals without ever having attended culinary school, without ever receiving formal training, without ever being recognized for the expertise I had developed. I learned to organize events that would make professional planners jealous, events that flowed seamlessly from one moment to the next. I became an expert in hospitality, in reading what people needed before they asked it of me, in creating experiences that made people feel valued and seen, while I myself remained unseen. Everything I learned, everything I developed as a skill, was used to serve others. My parents, my sister, their friends, the endless parade of society people who came through our home, seeking the Sullivan family's approval and attention. I was the machinery that made their world run smoothly, and like all machines, I was expected to function without complaint, without rest, without the need for acknowledgement or appreciation. My father was a distant figure, always away on business, always on the phone conducting deals, always focused on the next acquisition, the next investment, the next way to multiply his already considerable wealth. When he was home, he barely noticed me. He would sit in his study and take calls while I prepared his favorite meals, which he would eat absent-mindedly, without commenting on the flavor or the effort. But my mother, she actively worked to erase me from the family narrative. She made comments about my appearance, suggesting that Sarah had inherited the good looks while I had clearly gotten the short end of that genetic stick. She questioned every decision I made, every meal I prepared, every outfit I wore, every word I spoke. Nothing was ever good enough. Nothing was ever quite right. The duck was overcooked or undercooked. The sauce was too thin or too thick. My dress was unflattering or inappropriate. My voice was too loud or too timid. She had an opinion about everything, and it was never positive. And Sarah, my sister, she wasn't cruel in an obvious way, the way our mother was. She was simply indifferent. I was part of the furniture in her world, something that existed in the background to support her comfort, like a table or a chair or the air conditioning system. She thanked the house staff before she thanked me, even though I was her sister, even though I had sacrificed more for her happiness than anyone else in her life. She confided in her friends rather than in me, even though I was the one who had sat through every heartbreak, every disappointment, every late-night crisis, every moment of teenage drama. I became hardened by this treatment, not in an angry way, but in a way that was more dangerous. I became resigned. I accepted that this was my life, that this was my fate, that there was no possibility of change. There was something almost comforting about the inevitability of it all. I knew my role. I understood the rules. I could predict exactly what would happen, and when it would happen. The mansion became my entire world, and I became smaller and smaller within it, less visible, less real, more like a ghost haunting the halls of my own family's home. I had given up on the idea of being happy, and instead, I just tried to make everyone else happy. Everything changed on November 1st of the year I turned 32. That was the day my mother called me into her office again, and this time, I could feel it immediately. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. She explained with barely contained excitement that my father's company, Sullivan and Associates, a real estate and investment firm that had been operating for 30 years, was being considered for a massive government contract. The kind of contract that comes once in a lifetime. The CEO of one of the nation's largest corporations, a man named Jonathan Hayes who controlled a media empire and venture capital firm, was coming to their Christmas Eve party. This wasn't just any social gathering. This was the most important event my parents had ever hosted, the event that would determine the trajectory of my father's remaining career and the security of my entire family's future. Everything depended on impressing Jonathan Hayes. The contract was worth $300 million. It would secure my family's wealth for generations, money that would make us wealthier than we already were, which seemed almost impossible. More importantly to my parents, it would cement my father's legacy as one of the most powerful men in business, would secure his place in history, would make him unforgettable. My mother's eyes gleamed as she explained this to me, sitting behind that same mahogany desk where she had sent me away so many times before. There was a hunger there, a need to succeed that overrode every other consideration, every other thought, every other feeling. She told me that Sarah wanted to throw a small, intimate Christmas party for her closest friends, just 25 people, nothing elaborate, nothing that would overshadow my mother's own gatherings. But she needed me to handle all the food, every single dish. She needed me to create a menu that was sophisticated, impressive, elegant, the kind of food that would make Jonathan Hayes and the other important guests take notice of the Sullivan family's taste and refinement. The kind of food that would make them think that this was a family worth doing business with. And she needed it done in 24 hours. I remember standing in front of her desk, hearing these words, and feeling something shift inside of me. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't immediately agree. For the first time, I hesitated. I actually asked a question, something I rarely did. I asked my mother why she was putting this responsibility on me, why Sarah wasn't doing it herself, why my father wasn't coordinating this instead. My mother looked at me with such contempt in her eyes that I almost wished I hadn't asked. She said, with a voice that could cut glass, that Sarah was too busy with her own preparations, that my father was handling the really important business matters, and that I was good at this sort of thing, wasn't I? Didn't I understand that I was good at being useful? Wasn't that what I wanted? To be needed? To serve a purpose? And then she said something that I will never forget, something that I replay in my head sometimes when I'm trying to remember why I did what I did. She said, "Olivia, you're the only person in this family who is actually capable of pulling this off. So you will do it. You will create a menu that impresses the most important man in my husband's professional life. And you will do it without complaining, without making excuses, and without expecting recognition or gratitude, because that is what you do. That is what you are." I left her office and went to my room, a small suite on the 3rd floor that had been my refuge for so many years. It was modest compared to the rest of the house, decorated with things I had chosen, the only space in the mansion that felt like it was actually mine. I sat on my bed, and I cried. Not because I was surprised by what my mother had said. Not because I hadn't known all along that this was how my family saw me, as a tool, as a means to an end, as someone without intrinsic value. But because I finally, truly understood that nothing would ever change unless I changed it myself. That nothing would be different unless I was brave enough to make it different. That no one was coming to save me. There was no rescue coming. No fairy tale ending where someone recognized my worth and elevated me. I had to do it myself. That night, I made a decision that would alter the course of my entire life. I was going to do what my mother asked. I was going to create the most spectacular menu that anyone had ever seen. But I was also going to do something else. Something that would ensure that I could never be invisible again. Something that would transform me from a servant into a person of power. The next day, December 1st, I started preparing. I spent hours on the phone with suppliers, ordering the finest ingredients from the best sources. I created a 7-course tasting menu that would rival anything served at a 5-star restaurant in New York City or Paris or Tokyo. Pan-seared scallops with a champagne foam and a delicate microgreen garnish. Beef Wellington with a shallot and mushroom duxelle that was rich and earthy and perfect. Lobster bisque infused with saffron and finished with a touch of cognac. A delicate Dover sole in a brown butter sauce with capers and lemon. Each course was designed not just to taste exquisite, but to tell a story, to create an experience, to make the person eating it feel something deeper than just satisfaction. I wanted whoever tasted this food to understand that they were in the presence of someone with genuine talent. Someone with skill. Someone worth paying attention to. Someone worth investing in. And while I was cooking, while I was planning, while I was creating, I was also doing something else. I was gathering documents. I was making copies of papers that had been hidden in my father's home office, documents that he had kept locked away in a safe that I had discovered years ago and had quietly been observing. Copies of stock certificates with my name on them, proof of assets that had been set aside in my name. And most importantly, the one thing that would change everything, a will. My father's will, which stated, in clear legal language, that upon his death or upon my request, I was to inherit 40% of the company's shares. 40% of Sullivan and Associates. Not Sarah. Not my mother. Me. The invisible daughter. The maid. The one everyone had written off as expendable and worthless. I made copies of these documents. I hired a lawyer, quietly, discreetly, without telling anyone in my family, and I began the process of registering myself as a corporate shareholder. It took time, and it took care, and it took courage, but it was possible. The legal framework was there. My father had made sure of it, perhaps as some kind of hedge against whatever he suspected was happening with my mother. Or perhaps he had simply made the decision years ago and never bothered to change it. Either way, the documents existed. All I had to do was activate them. December 24th arrived like a storm on the horizon. The mansion was transformed into a winter wonderland, decorated with white lights and fresh greenery, the kind of effortless elegance that actually required days of work and thousands of dollars. I moved through the house like a ghost, hanging decorations, arranging flowers, preparing the dining room for the most important dinner that my parents believed would ever happen in their lives. My mother watched me work, occasionally offering criticisms, occasionally making suggestions that would require me to redo something I had already completed perfectly. Sarah floated through the rooms in a cloud of self-importance, trying on different outfits, taking selfies, preparing to be the perfect hostess to her friends, oblivious to the fact that her world was about to shift. My father was on the phone almost constantly, preparing for what he believed would be the most important meeting of his professional career, the meeting that would secure his legacy. The guests started arriving around 7 in the evening. I watched from the kitchen as the house filled with people, as champagne flutes clinked, as laughter echoed through the halls. Jonathan Hayes arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, exactly on time, the way powerful people do. I glimpsed him as I was setting up the kitchen for the final push before dinner service. He was a tall man, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that seemed to precede him like a force field. My father had his arm around him immediately, steering him toward the drawing room where my mother was waiting with drinks and carefully calculated charm. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Everything was going according to my parents' script. Except I had made one small addition to the evening, one secret move that my parents didn't know about. I had contacted Jonathan Hayes' personal assistant the week before, using my father's email address without his knowledge, and I had sent her a detailed message explaining that I had created this evening's menu and offering to provide her with information about my background, my experience, and my credentials as a culinary professional. I explained that I was interested in discussing potential employment opportunities, that I believed I had skills that might be valuable to a man of his stature and success. I explained that I was trying to break free from a family situation that was holding me back, that I had talents that were being wasted, that I was ready to take my life in a different direction. I expected her to delete the email. I expected nothing to come of it. I expected that I would be invisible in her inbox like I was invisible in every other part of my life. But then, something unexpected happened. She responded. She said that Mr. Hayes was always interested in meeting talented people, that he had built his business empire by recognizing potential in places others overlooked, that he had a philosophy of finding diamonds in the rough. She said she would ensure he was aware of my involvement in this evening's preparations. She asked me to prepare something special, something that would showcase my abilities in a way that the standard menu could not. So I did. I created an additional course, something that was not on the menu that my mother had approved. A delicate dish of seared duck breast with a cherry gastrique, accompanied by a polenta infused with truffle oil and finished with a microgreen salad that was dressed with a champagne vinaigrette that I had reduced myself. It was a dish that had taken me months to perfect, a dish that was entirely my own creation, a signature of sorts, something that could only have come from my hands and my mind. I plated it with precision, with artistry, with the kind of care that comes from knowing that this might be your only chance to be seen. I made sure that Jonathan Hayes received it with a note explaining that this course was my personal creation, prepared specifically for him as a demonstration of my culinary philosophy and my vision. When he tasted it, everything stopped. My mother was mid-sentence, telling him about something related to my father's company, when Jonathan Hayes put down his fork and said something that echoed through the dining room and changed everything. He said, "This is extraordinary. Who is responsible for this meal?" My mother started to respond, started to take credit the way she had done so many times before, but my father, to his credit, stopped her. He said the truth. He said that I had prepared the entire menu, that I had done all of the cooking, that I was his daughter, and that, yes, she was living at home and helping with various family matters. Jonathan Hayes looked at my father with an expression that was difficult to read, something between respect and knowing amusement. Then he asked if he could speak with me, if I would come out of the kitchen and join him for a moment. My mother's face turned pale. She started to protest, to explain that I was simply the hired help for the evening, that I wouldn't be appropriate to include in the dinner conversation, that I might embarrass them or say something wrong. But Jonathan Hayes simply smiled and said, "I'm not interested in speaking with your hired help. I'm interested in speaking with the person who prepared this food. And I suspect, based on what I've read about corporate credentials, that there's a great deal more to Ms. Olivia Sullivan than you've indicated." My heart stopped. He knew. Somehow, he already knew. He had already figured it out. Later, he would explain that he had received my email, had done his research, had discovered the corporate filings, had understood exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it. He said he had built his business by recognizing people who had the intelligence, the courage, and the determination to advocate for themselves. He said that most people in the world waited for someone else to give them permission to succeed. But people like me, people who were willing to take risks, who were willing to make bold moves even when the odds were against them, who were willing to be vulnerable and strategic at the same time, those were the people who actually changed the world. I stood in the dining room of my family's home, wearing the clothes of an invisible daughter, my hair pulled back, my hands still bearing the marks of cooking all day, and Jonathan Hayes looked at me and said, "Miss Sullivan, I believe we should discuss an opportunity. You have exactly the kind of mind and talent that my organization desperately needs. But more than that, I think you should know that your father has already granted you 40% of his company's shares in his will, and you have legally registered as a corporate shareholder. That means you're not just the woman who cooked this meal. You're one of the most significant stakeholders in your father's business. That makes you not just talented, Miss Sullivan. That makes you powerful." The room erupted. My mother stood up so quickly that she knocked over her wine glass, which spilled across the tablecloth like blood. My father's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to something that might have been grudging respect. Sarah just stared at me with her mouth open, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jonathan Hayes reached over and shook my hand. He said, "Congratulations, Miss Sullivan. You've just inherited your seat at the table. Now, let's talk about what you're going to do with it." The rest of the evening was a blur. People came up to me and congratulated me on my cooking. Jonathan Hayes spent the next 2 hours discussing a position with me, a role that would involve consulting for his company, helping to develop hospitality and corporate event strategies, work that would pay me more in a year than my parents had allowed me to earn in my entire life. He offered me a salary that made me feel dizzy. He offered me stock options. He offered me the opportunity to finally be seen, valued, and respected. My father pulled me aside at one point and asked me how long I had known. I told him that I had discovered his will by accident, years ago while looking for something else, and that I had finally decided to do something about it. I told him that I had reached the breaking point, that I couldn't live as an invisible ghost in my own family anymore. He said something that I didn't expect. He said he was proud of me, that he had always intended for me to have that inheritance, that he had wanted me to have that power, but that he had never known how to give it to me in a way that my mother would accept. He had hoped that by putting it in his will, by setting it up legally, that eventually I would discover it and claim what was mine. He said, "Your mother never would have allowed this if she had known, and I didn't have the courage to fight her openly. But you, Olivia, you found another way. You made yourself impossible to ignore." My mother left the party early. She said she had a headache, but really, I think she had just realized that her control over me was gone, that she could no longer manipulate me, that the power dynamic that had defined our relationship had shifted irrevocably. Sarah followed her upstairs, and for the first time in her life, I think she actually understood that I was not her servant. I was not her invisible sister. I was a person with value, with power, with a future that didn't revolve around meeting her needs and making her look good. That night, I slept better than I had slept in 15 years. I woke up on Christmas morning as a different person. The invisible daughter was gone. In her place was a woman who had finally claimed her own story. A woman who had taken the skills that were meant to diminish her and used them to elevate herself. A woman who had learned that sometimes you have to build your own power rather than waiting for someone else to grant it to you. The weeks after Christmas were complicated and difficult. My mother tried to manipulate me, to threaten me, to make me feel guilty for what I had done. She said I had embarrassed the family, that I had made a scene in front of important people, that I was being ungrateful for everything they had provided for me. But I had learned something important during that dinner with Jonathan Hayes. I had learned that my mother's opinion of me didn't matter. What mattered was my opinion of myself. What mattered was my ability to recognize my own worth and to claim it boldly. Within 3 months, I had accepted the position with Jonathan Hayes' company. Within 6 months, I had moved out of my parents' house and into an apartment in the city, an apartment that I chose and paid for myself. Within a year, I had begun attending board meetings, contributing to strategic decisions, and building a reputation as someone who had genuine insight into corporate culture and employee engagement. My father eventually came around completely. He began to see me differently, to treat me with the respect that I had earned, to include me in family business discussions in ways he never had before. Sarah eventually apologized, though it took time, and we began to rebuild our relationship on more equal footing. She realized that I had always been there for her, and she wanted to be there for me now. My mother never really accepted what had happened, and we have a distant relationship now. She is cordial when we see each other at family events, but there is an unspoken tension that will probably never fully go away. But that's okay. I don't need her approval anymore. I never should have needed it in the first place. What I want you to understand if you're listening to this story is that invisibility is a choice. It's not something that's done to you completely beyond your control. It's something that you allow by not fighting back, by not claiming what's yours, by not demanding to be seen and heard and valued. For 15 years, I made that choice. I chose to be invisible because it was easier than fighting. It was more comfortable than risk. It was safer than failure. But once I stopped making that choice, once I decided that I deserved better, everything changed. I realized that the skills I had developed in service to my family were actually incredible assets that most people never develop. The ability to read people, to understand what they need before they ask for it, to create experiences that matter and make people feel valued. These are the qualities of a true leader. The willingness to work hard, to pursue excellence, to do what needs to be done even when it's difficult and exhausting. These are the qualities of someone destined for success. And the intelligence to recognize that I could claim power rather than waiting for it to be given to me. Well, that's the quality that separates people who succeed from people who never do. Today, I work as a corporate consultant and strategist for one of the largest companies in America. I earn a six-figure salary. I have shares in my father's company worth millions of dollars. I have a life that I built for myself, that nobody handed to me, that came from my own effort and courage and determination and strategic thinking. And I will never be invisible again. I will never settle for less than I deserve. I will never wait for someone else to give me permission to be great. This is the story of how I stopped being a maid in my own life and became the boss of my own destiny. And it all started with one meal, one moment of courage, and the decision to finally claim what was always mine.